Well, welcome everyone. My name's Alison Watts. I'm here from the Southern Cross Postgraduate Association and I'm very pleased to be hosting this workshop this morning, writing an even more excellent literature review workshop delivered by Dr. Patrick Danaher. So we are recording and I will post a link out to everybody to our YouTube channel where you can watch it again. Please subscribe. And I also encourage you to become a member of the Postgraduate Association. It's free, the form only takes 1 or 2 minutes, and it keeps all these great workshops going all year for postgraduate students. So I'll post a few links in the chat for you. And over to you, Patrick. Let's get going, hey?
Thanks so much, Alison, and good morning, everyone, and great to see everyone here. All right, so yes, it really is terrific, and I really enjoy working with Alison and with the Southern Cross Postgraduate Association, who do an absolutely fabulous job, and as far as I can see, are the very best in the whole of Australia, maybe even Australasia. How's that for a grand claim on Wednesday morning? But really do excellent work in terms of these workshops and student advocacy and support and so on. Just a very quick note about the title, An Even More Excellent Literature Review. Some of you may know, or you may not know, that Alison kindly invited me to do a series of these workshops in the second half of last year, and I really enjoyed doing that. And as Alison mentioned a moment ago, the idea is to keep them and all the other fabulous recordings on SCPA's really very impressive YouTube channel. And so when we talked about doing another series of these workshops, Alice and I were chatting about this, and we agree that it's important to add value rather than just repeating them, to have some new material and so on. So previously, last year, it was writing an excellent literature review. And so we thought maybe even more excellent is just a way to differentiate the workshop. So there are there is a common denominator in that Venn diagram kind of sense between last year and this year, but there is some new material, and of course all of you are new as well. And so I'm hoping that to leave some time at the end to have a conversation and to see where you are all up to with your literature reviews and so on. All right, in terms of acknowledgement of country, on behalf of Empowering Editing, with whom I work, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today. And for me here in Toowoomba, that's the Jagera, Jaibal and Jawa peoples. And we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. All right, this is the overview and I'll get straight into it. But just to highlight, just before I do, one of the new items from this year compared with last year is item 2, an overarching proposition. So I'll get to that in a moment. I do reiterate grateful thanks. Alison does an absolutely fabulous job, among other things, all the other things that she does, of organising these workshops, and I enjoy them thoroughly. And as Alison just mentioned with the YouTube channel, I really encourage people, you may know this already, but there's an incredibly rich breadth and depth of material in the whole series, the whole library or corpus or whatever collective noun we want to use for those videos. And I thank you as well for coming along today and engaging and so on. And all right, so this is the overarching proposition, and this is new from the workshop last year. And so just thinking about this particular workshop around literature review, thinking about the way that I approached it this time last year and so on, and also working with a number of current HDR students and so on. At least from my perspective, in a sense, the essence of writing an even more excellent literature review, it's really about thinking about the kinds of scholarly relationships that we have with multiple others. And so clearly, when we're writing a literature review, presumably the audience is future tense, unless you're doing something that's current and with your supervisors and so on. But future tense might be if you're doing a publication, a systematic literature review, or something like that. It may well be your thesis, thinking about the thesis examiners and so on. And so I think it's, and again, apologies if you do this anyway already, but I think it is useful to think about who are the readers of this particular text and what are they expecting and hoping to see, and how might I, in writing this review, help them to see what they're hoping and expecting to read and so on. It's also important, particularly with a literature review, I would think, that we think about who are the other researchers in the field or fields that we're seeking to contribute to in terms of the literature review and so on. Some of those people have very likely have passed on. They're no longer around. There are other people who are current researchers, and hopefully there are future researchers as well who might come along, come across your work later, and so on. So I think it's certainly from my perspective, collegiality and community are really important values and principles that, when universities and other educational institutions are at their best, those values thrive, they're alive, they animate and sustain and motivate us. And so that's a sense of who else is in this particular field that I'm working in. And also thinking about end users. Now, in the kind of research I do, qualitative research, education research, the end users typically are the readers, are other HDR students, but also working in education. They may well be teachers, students, policymakers, educational system leaders, and so on. And so I think it's useful to think about the literature review as a text that has a certain form and function and hopefully multiple readers. Oops, sorry, got too excited there. So this may be true of some other people as well. I'm fascinated by the metaphor, the concept or whatever of sojourners. And I think it applies to writing literature review. Sojourners in the sense of fellow travelers on a shared journey of discovery. And so that's important because it highlights that we don't currently have full knowledge. We don't have comprehensive and complete and unchanging understanding of a particular phenomenon or issue or debate, because if we did, we wouldn't need any new literature reviews and any new research. So in other words, the fields that we contribute to are dynamic and fluid and shifting, and we are part of that with many, many other people. Sorry. And so whether we call this a disposition or a mindset or something else, I think there are certain attributes or features or psychological phenomena or whatever that are useful to think about, particularly with regard to the literature review. One of those is curiosity. And certainly all the people I've worked with have been, sometimes not initially, but have become curious or more curious over time about the field. And so being alive to new ideas as they come along, a commitment to enhancing the field, to seeing the literature review and the broader thesis or publication or whatever you're working on, to see those tasks, those texts and tasks as contributing or helping to enhance the field. Being respectful of others' contributions. Now, mostly I do see that. Occasionally I see people or read something that's written by someone that, at least for me, is a little bit disrespectful in tone. It doesn't mean that we have to bow down and worship and so on other people uncritically, but occasionally I come across people who've got the idea of being critical, and for me it's a little bit misguided, because its effect, if not its intention, is to devalue and diminish. It's almost like saying, well, no, terra nullius, nothing of any value existed before my study came along. Whereas, clearly that's not the case. Being humble up to a point about one's own contribution. And that reminded me of the wonderful Charles Dickens character, Uriah Heep. I had to look him up before David Copperfield. So there is a false modesty and a false humility, but I'm not talking about that. It's really, again, just this notion about collegiality and community, that we're part of a chain or a long line of people, some of whom we may disagree profoundly with, but I guess starting from the proposition that all of us are genuinely committed to extending the learning and the understanding and so on. This one at the end, demonstrably assertive about one's own contribution. If when I examine a thesis, I'm more likely to see this as a concern than people being overly assertive, I guess. And so occasionally, as when I write an examiner's report, I might include the comment that, if something to the effect, you could afford to be more assertive, or make even clearer what your particular contribution to knowledge is. So that's a bit of a fine line. It's being humble, but it's also being confidently and appropriately clear and assertive about what it is that you have contributed to the field. Now, that takes time. You can't do that the first day that you begin reading the literature. That does take time to develop that clear sense of what's there and what you're adding. A couple of caveats. There are many, many different ways that we can structure and plan and so on a literature review. As we know, if you're using classical grounded theory, for instance, the literature review tends to go at the end of the thesis after the data analysis, because that's the way that they do that. So again, go with what your supervisors are saying and so on. This is not meant to challenge or contest that. Just a couple of things, some of the slides, particularly from last year, were at least had their starting point at an earlier presentation. But a good friend of mine is Fred Dervin, who works in intercultural education. He's originally French and English, but he's worked in Finland for many years. He's currently at the University of Helsinki. And Fred is one of these people, and I admire them enormously, who has two PhDs, and one is from the University of Turku in Finland, where he worked for some years. But I think it was his first one. His first PhD was at the Sorbonne in Paris. And I vividly remember Fred saying to a group of us, he went along, he met his supervisor. In those days, there was just one supervisor. She said, "Pleased to meet you. I don't want to see you for 6 months. I want you to go away and read, read, read." And it was about that long, the meeting. Maybe they had coffee together, I don't know. But she didn't say for a moment what he should be reading. She assumed that he would find that out, or would have starting points for the reading and so on. And so then he came back, and he'd read hugely, and he had written quite a lot. And that was the starting point then of their conversation around that. Okay, so just a little bit about me. This is more for the this workshop, but also the future ones. Just a bit of background. I was at Central Queensland University for many years. Then I was at University of Southern Queensland for even more years. I retired from there in June 2023. Since then, I've had a part-time role at Excelsior University College in Sydney. I've had the huge privilege of co-supervising 56 doctoral students to graduation, which is just brilliant. Another one of them is currently finishing his examiner's reports and so on. It's just a personal thing. I know some people have many more than this, but I would like to get to 60. No, I'm over 60 years old. I'd like to get to 60 graduated doctoral students if possible. We'll see how we go. And I've also had the privilege of examining 45 doctoral theses to date, and PhD, DBA, and so on in Australia and in other countries. And the reason I mention that is that for this workshop, I've picked up a lot of strategies and also the different ways, the different ways that people can write equally legitimate and valid and sound literature reviews. And basically, I'm qualitative research or education research and so on. All right, so even more excellent and so on. What do we mean by that? I guess we mean in this context, high quality or first class, whatever that might mean. But it's really about thinking about the demonstrated and consistent effectiveness and fitness for purpose. Now, When I was doing my PhD thesis decades ago, I vividly remember lying awake at night, and I think all universities have this, some variation on the wording, but at CQU, where I did my PhD, it was original and significant contribution to knowledge for the whole thesis. Now, I used to lie awake thinking, oh, I'll never get one of those. Where can I get one of those? Can I buy one of those? It really concerned me. But other um, other people, including my wonderful and very patient supervisors, said, of course you can do that. That evolves over time. Similarly, when you're looking at the literature review, you might get anxious or stressed and think you might be working in a field where there's so much already, and we'll come to that shortly, in which case it's important to set your boundaries around what you're doing. It might be a field where there's actually not very much, and you might need to widen the field a little bit. But in terms of things like the word count, which we'll come to in a moment as well, all of those things constrain and contain your literature review very appropriately. And often as students, we inflate or exaggerate and make bigger than it is what the task is. So often with the literature review, we think, oh, it's got to be totally comprehensive. It's got to include and refer to every single study that's been published in that topic. Well, I would imagine mostly that's impossible to do. And we'll come to this in a moment as well, examiners are not actually looking for that. They don't expect that for a moment. So it's really just thinking about excellent, but putting excellence in its place so that it's manageable. Okay, now in terms of a note of encouragement, some of you might have come across this before. And again, I won't use this for future slides in this series of workshops, but I think it is important to start with this. Margaret Kiley has done some excellent work with her colleague Mullins and other people as well. But I love the title of this paper. It's 23 years old now. It's a PhD, not a Nobel Prize, How Experienced Examiners Assess Research Theses. And it's just to encourage all of you that the research that they did through interviews and so on, they found that these were experienced examiners, and my own experience in the intervening time is that it's still the same. Examiners basically want you to pass. They want to look at your work. And I certainly do this as an examiner, they approach the task of examining, assuming that this thesis has already gone through the checks and balances of the respective university. So it's gone through confirmation of candidature, it's gone through if people have a viva or whatever, or a pre-submission seminar. It's gone through feedback from the supervisors and all of those things. Sometimes people are presented at the Praxis conference organised by SCPA and so on. So examiners approach the task assuming that it will pass. And then the question really is, what kind of feedback will be provided that's most useful to adding value to this thesis? You may be fortunate, you might have finished yours, and you may have had this wonderful experience already, that your thesis is passed without amendment or without correction or whatever, without revisions. That's wonderful. But my experience is, and this didn't happen to me either, my experience is people generally have some kind of revisions. I certainly did. And that's because if you're writing for a PhD 80,000, 100,000 words, inevitably there are things that people want to comment on and say, well, this could be presented clearer, or I didn't understand that, or a bit more contextual information here would be really useful. All right, so anyway, that's really important. Now, at the bottom of this slide, all you need to do is to demonstrate your capacity for independent critical thinking. A PhD is 3 years, full-time equivalent, or sometimes longer, of solid work, not a Nobel Prize. So you still contribute to original and significant knowledge, but you're not in line for Nobel Prize, which reduces the pressure somewhat. And then this centre, I think it's still going, the University of Newcastle, has done some wonderful work over the years about things like examiners' references to theory in PhD theses and so on, and PhD candidates and theory and so on. So I really recommend having a look at it if you have the time to do so. Okay, now, building on what I was saying before about the relationships with people, a scholarly voice is the centerpiece of the thesis, including the literature review, is really important. And I talk about this quite a lot in this workshop series, and people might say, well, what on earth is Patrick talking about here? You know, I say it's a key requirement for an even more excellent literature review, but I also say it's elusive, it's slippery, it's a bit like a mirage in a desert, it's over there. Um, what is it? Uh, it is slippery, it is elusive. It's your own authentic scholarly voice, and it definitely takes time to develop. All of us, we're not blank slates. This is not a deficit model of HDR students. We all bring huge skills and experience, sometimes over decades of life and work and so on, to the HDR study and to the literature review. But this is specialized language, vocabulary, uh, generic structures, and all the rest of it. It's definitely attainable because basically my sense is it's really difficult to get to pass your HDR thesis without a scholarly voice that's coming through. So a very quick real life example, the wonderful Teresa Moore, when I worked at CQU many moons ago, Teresa did an excellent study with academic women in a regional university. And I suspect that the issues that she highlighted around, she had this wonderful metaphor, I think it's in her title, of the fellow-centric smog. And for her, the smog was a very vivid and experientially felt metaphor of all of the behaviors that go with fellow-centric behavior and so on. Anyway, Teresa was quoting lots of feminist writers and so on, feminist post-structuralist writers. And perhaps inevitably, she started off by deferring to them. And so whether that was bell hooks or lots of other really excellent writers, she would write about what they had written in the literature review, but we never really picked up what she thought about these issues. And so the feedback was usually, that's great, Teresa, what do you think? What's your position? You've highlighted a particular debate in the literature here. Where do you stand? And anyway, Rosie's Coffee Shop, one Monday morning, we met in the last 6 months, every Monday morning at Rosie. We took turns to shout the coffee and so on. And I vividly remember one of those Monday mornings, and I arrived first and I said, my shout for coffee, Teresa, you've got it. You found your voice, because something happened. And it was a shift in her writing that came through so strongly. And bell hooks and these other wonderful people moved to the background of her thesis, and her voice, not to take over, but she was front and center. So that's an example of that. So as I say there, it's your voice, it's taking center stage. It is elusive, and so the articulation of your scholarly voice is highly variable. It looks and feels differently and so on. One of the new sets of slides for today is I've got some discipline specific examples related to health, engineering and education, which we'll get to shortly. All right, now a word about word count. I really should update this table, but so this is very old now. I just selected 8. I think they're all PhD theses. They're all doctoral theses anyway, as you can tell from the total word count. And obviously I didn't have enough to do in my life at the time. So I counted up all of these different parts of those 8 theses. And just to highlight the range of word count. So this is the graduated final versions of these theses. And so, 16, almost 17,000, 16 and a half, 9.5, almost 19, almost 13s, almost 8, 15. I think H is me from memory. So that's a fair range of literature review. And so if we think about it, 7,761 compared with 18,672, we might think, oh, is this one a bit light on? But if we look at F, its conceptual framework is 24,000 words long. So one of the things we need to do is to think about where and how does the literature review fit with other elements of the thesis? How does it complement and yet contribute uniquely to the developing picture? And the other thing is the percentage of the total word count is ranging from 9% through to almost 20%. And so, I'm not sure what that shows except variability and the fact that that variability is legitimate. Okay, so some tensions to navigate. And you may well have encountered these already. One of those is being comprehensive versus being proportionate. And so really what I mean about this, and this comes to the last point in this slide as well, and that's setting boundaries around what's in scope and what's out of scope. And so being comprehensive may be a subset or a subfield of a larger field. So you may start by thinking, and I'm, being ironic here, I'm not a literacy educator, but, I don't know, it might be something about debates about teaching reading in children, which, as we know, goes on for generation after generation and decade after decade, country after country. And it seems to be one of those hardy perennials that hasn't been resolved. And sometimes that debate has become very fierce and so on. So if you, as an example, if you were locating your study in something like that, you might actually want to look at a subfield, which it's not my field, so I don't really know, but it might be something about phonemes, for example, or that might be too specific. It might be, but it might be particular kinds of strategies about teaching reading, or it might be teaching reading for people for whom English is not their first language, or whatever, and so this debate or tension is really framed and addressed by your context and the material you're working with, how many words you've got available to you, how much time you've got available to you. And I guess a related one is breadth versus depth. So as a as a hugely general and very rough guide in a thesis, I think, and we encounter this breadth versus depth debate or tension lots of times, including with data gathering. And my general feeling is that depth normally wins out. So in other words, if I'm working with a student and they want to work in 5 different schools or health centres or whatever, and then the other supervisor and I might say, well, you might want to think about 1 or 2. If comparison is part of what you want to do, you might have 2, but it's probably better to aim for depth within that. Inevitably, if you have 5 centres, whatever they are, you've got words and time to go to those centres, to describe those centres, etc., etc. But that's not always the case. So it's just something to think about. Another one is seminal versus contemporary. And of course, there are contemporary references that are seminal as well. Seminal doesn't, as we know, doesn't just refer to decades ago or whatever, but it's something to bear in mind. And it's, again, a lot of this is judgment, your own judgment. What makes something seminal in your field? Is it the number of people who refer to it, who cite it? As we know, sometimes with citation indices, they're basically saying this is rubbish. So that's that study. Don't read that. But ironically, paradoxically, that person might get a high citation index, even though some people think what they've written is not worthwhile. So it's exercising judgment about all of these. A lot of this is about signposting and making really clear what is in and out of scope for your literature review. And that's really about managing expectations so that if it's a supervisor, an examiner, a peer reviewer, if you're sending it off to a journal, that they understand what it is you're seeking to do. They might still have their own view about that, but they know that you're saying, I'm looking at this, I'm not looking at these other things within the same field. Okay, just very quickly, I find this useful. Some people may not find it useful. And all it is really is often, but not always, often in a generic structure for a thesis, you've got chapter 1 introduction, chapter 2 literature review, chapter 3 conceptual framework or theoretical framework. Some people have chapter 3 as the research design. Sometimes that's chapter 4. Sometimes people's conceptual framework is at the end of their literature review. There are many different ways to do it, but it's just making the point that it may help you to think about the literature review as a contextual framework, as opposed to the conceptual framework, because obviously they're aligned, they should be aligned, they're complementary, but they serve different functions. And so if we think about this, and I have, yes, so it's really just making the point about scholarly voice, judgment and analysis and so on. Okay. Now, again, quite often when you're writing about the literature review, writing the literature review, quite often we come across this notion of addressing a gap or filling a gap in the knowledge and so on. And so I've used that myself, and I work with people who use that notion. It's just to share with you that Pat Thompson, who's Australian, and but spent many years at the University of Nottingham in the UK, and now she's back in Australia. I think she's at the university. I think she's in Sydney. I might have that wrong. Anyway, she writes an excellent blog called Patter, Patter, all lowercase, and I really recommend it because Pat is full professor. She's written lots of books, done lots of research projects. She's very practical. She's very common sense. Let's do this. Let's make this work. And so her blog posts typically are quite short, but there's a lot of wisdom and knowledge and experience in them. And anyway, this caught my eye last year. So filling the gap. So according to Pat Thompson, gap sometimes overstates the reality of most disciplines. The majority of us work in occupied spaces where there's already a lot of research activity going on. Where there actually is a big space, it's unlikely that one researcher or one research project will fill it. So all that she's really saying is just be cautious. If you can still use that metaphor, the research gap, but just be careful and cautious about how you use it. Now, I wasn't familiar with this as an acronym and so on, but maybe this is a very British research thing or education research thing. Create a research space. It's got its own acronym, CARS. And so Pat says it's additive, it's based, and it's potentially competitive model of knowledge. So it's almost like saying knowledge is fixed, it's finite, we've got this bit of knowledge here, you're writing your thesis, you're adding to this particular body of knowledge by addressing this quite specific research gap. And she acknowledges sometimes that's appropriate, but she's just saying sometimes that doesn't fit. She thinks CARS, create your research space, create a research space, is a timid notion, which I think is a really interesting critique. And so she said there are lots of other ways that we can contribute to extending the field and so on. And Alison, you're brilliant. Thanks so much for finding it. That's really good. Okay, and then I like this. There may be a good reason why no one's filling the gap. It's not interesting or it's not significant. So just because a gap is there doesn't mean that we have to fill that gap. Okay, so I've got three, hopefully, summary graphics, and these are also new material from last year. I'll keep an eye on the time. Okay, so University of New South Wales Library, they've got a really good service there. And I just really like this graphic because it's a bit like I think a kaleidoscope or something. You know, the way that we read in the West, I guess we read from left to right, but sometimes we might think we read from top to bottom. So we might start with this one. What are the key theories, concepts, and ideas, and go around like that. In a sense, it doesn't actually matter because the point is each of those questions is really important to ask about our literature review that we're writing in the body of literature. So some of those are, you know, I guess more straightforward, like what are the origins and definitions of the topic, and how is knowledge on the topic structured and organized, and so on. But also, what are the political standpoints, if there are some in that? What are the key theories, concepts, and ideas? What are the epistemological and ontological grounds for the discipline, and so on? So I think there's a lot in there that could repay coming back to. Now, some of you, I'm sure, are far more familiar with Prisma than I am, but it's one of a number of very well regarded frameworks for setting out the literature review and so on. If you're not familiar, it stands for Preferred Reporting Items for Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analyses. Take a deep breath. Developed in 2009, updated in 2020. It's still got 27 items. I was reading briefly about that this morning and saying the 2020 version is about making these steps even more explicit. And that's part of, I guess, part of concerns about AI and authenticity, but it's also scholarly generosity that is making really clear what you've already done, not least, if someone's interested in doing a replication study of your work, that you're helping them to do that by saying, this is really clearly and specifically what I did. It's interesting. I couldn't change that, but that's clearly a typo. Mother et al. Was actually Moher et al. So interesting. And this one from Christine Bruce. Now, Christine Bruce, you may know, some of you, originally from QUT, where she spent a lot of time. She's done foundational work in phenomenography, which is a really interesting qualitative research method. And I'm not sure she's still there, but certainly a couple of years ago, she headed up the graduate research school at James Cook University in Townsville. Anyway, she elicited, as people familiar with phenomenography, Christine elicited these qualitatively different understandings by research students. I think her question was something like, what is a literature review, or what is a literature review for? And so she, in no particular order, people tended to talk, well, some people, or one conception is, it's a list. It's a list of so-and-so did that, so-and-so wrote that, someone else came along and did that. It's a search, so it's very much a search function, a voyage of, or a travel of discovery to see what's out there. It's a survey. Now, a survey and search, you might think they're the same, but I think there are some interesting nuances and differences between those, the function of those. It's a vehicle for learning, and I think this is a really interesting one. And so hopefully that will assist you as well to think about your text, not as needing to demonstrate your mastery of all this material, and like Mastermind, someone will throw these questions at you and you expect to know all of this incredibly intricate detail. It's more about, what are you learning as you're engaging with this material, and what can you teach fellow sojourners? And this, I guess, related, similar in terms of research facilitation. How does your literature review help you and others to facilitate research in that field? And so thinking about that, and then report might seem simplistic, but actually it's a bit like what I started with. Who are the audiences and what are the purposes of your literature review? Who are the end users, and how can you report clearly, comprehensively, but also communicate in an engaging way with those audiences? Okay, so conscious of the time, I'm going quickly, I know that, but I do want to get time for a bit of discussion. Anyway, so in terms of discipline-specific examples, Alison kindly shared a number of you are in health and so on. This is a thesis from University of Umeå, which I may well have mispronounced, in the north of Sweden, and it was about the social determinants of health. And just a couple of things to share with you about that. Now, lots of words, and it's not about focusing on the individual words, but what struck me even from the table of contents of this thesis was this person is clearly interested in, probably fascinated by, maybe obsessed with social determinants of health and how they link with social inequalities in health and so on, and has taken a life course approach to the thesis. And that's really interesting. So in chapter 1, the introductory chapter, she has gone through and outlined all of these. So these are presented as background to the study and setting the parameters for the study and so on. Now, in practical terms, it's a bit like a black box. We don't know. Some of this information I'm sure she had before she even started her PhD, but some of it I'm pretty sure was gleaned from the literature review. And that doesn't matter. This is the finished product. This is the presentation of the clear, coherent text with as many as possible of the underlying inconsistencies and uncertainties and tensions ironed out, because that's what a thesis does. But interestingly, then when she came to do the literature review, which is called previous research, she's got these 4 key areas that she's identified. Now, clearly there's overlap between them, but in the actual thesis, the literature review, in one sense, stands on its own. It is autonomous and it serves its function. So people, if they wanted to, could go to her thesis and just read the literature review, and they would be really informed, as at 2018, what's the state of the field here in terms of these particular kinds of things. And even in the selection of names for the sections, she's signaling and signposting really clearly what are the aspects of the literature that she looked at. Now, again, lots of words, but I just want to share with you how we write about, or can write about, the literature review in the thesis itself. So, socioeconomic inequalities in health exist at contextual levels. This, I think, is from the, oh no, it wouldn't be from the abstract, it's further on. I think at the start, that's right, sorry, it was the start of the literature review. It's quite a short thesis because there are publications as well. So if we think about, social inequalities, economic inequalities, this has been acknowledged by a large and growing body of neighbourhood effects and health research. But she said, instead of drawing on a life course perspective, this field has mainly used cross-sectional data and so on. So there again, it's respectful, it's clear, it's saying this body of knowledge already exists. I'm familiar with this literature. I have identified, she may use the term gap, I can't recall, but no, scarcity. But effectively, she's identified a gap or an absence or a limitation of that existing research. She's very interested in life course. And so she then goes on and says there's a scarcity of research using that approach. And then she says, while these conditions could be important, etc., hardly any studies have assessed their contribution to neighbourhood deprivation inequalities in health. Really clear, really specific, contextually and discipline specific and appropriate. So engineering, some of you are from Faculty of Science and Engineering and so on. This is a master's thesis, coincidentally also from Sweden, in relation to an aspect of engineering. And so I just thought this is interesting in terms of how this person has approached the existing literature. And so if we look at this before, so we've got this advanced VSC method and so on, and it predicts all of these things that I don't understand but are clearly very important. And then the method is therefore possible to apply already to this massing stage of building design, etc. And the model was found to have an accuracy of 80% of the test cases. So that precision, that specificity is really important to showing that this person knows what he's talking about, he knows the field. When we read that, we think, if we read up to that point, thus it's a great potential, we might think, okay, so why do you need to do your study? If it's already got 80%, that seems pretty good. What's new? So he said, therefore, the method is not proven for irregular room and window geometry. And so these particular geometrical conditions were used when applying the formula in the present study. Okay, and then also I liked here, so and the next slide shows this as well. One of the signs of your scholarly voice in the literature review is that you make judgments and decisions about the field. And so it may well be that this person read somewhere that there are these 2 types about identified barriers, or it may be, perhaps more likely, he came across different kinds of barriers and so on. The fact that he has not cited suggests that this is his voice. He's identified this differentiation into 2 types. Now we might think, well, that's obvious, but it's actually a very useful thing to do cognitively and semantically and so on. And so on the one hand, and then on the other hand, and then Also, I think this is really interesting. He was doing his topic. He found, lo and behold, there's not much about Sweden, even though he's in Sweden. And so he made the decision to extend the field to other European countries and so on, to make considered to be representative. And so, as an examiner, um, and I would think to myself, tick, that's great. That's really good scholarly decision making. That's appropriate. You've brought in enough material without, overtaking your study. Sorry. This other strategy, Alice Brown, 2012, wrote a really interesting thesis at USQ about active play opportunities for parents with young children, very young children, and so on. And so what she did a very comprehensive literature review, and toddlers are characterized locomotive skills, locomotor skills, and so on. But then what she did was she created this table, which I think is brilliant. And she could have added in text references and so on to augment it. Sometimes you see tables like that. But in other words, it's a work of synthesis. This is part of Alice's contribution to knowledge, where she's developed these physical activity classifications from the literature. So that's clearly her showing her mastery of and confidence in navigating the relevant literature and so on. Okay, so almost at an end for the presentation part of it. So just really to encourage all of you, the good thing is there are lots of exemplars around literature reviews and so on. When you look at those, you might think, oh, that's very different from that, and absolutely. So I guess it's finding things that work for you and so on. Also exercising your own judgment, obviously in conversation with your supervisors and other people and so on, is really crucial, because then you clearly demonstrate that you have your scholarly voice and that you're worth listening to. There are lots of different representational strategies and so on, and they are effective, and they can make your literature review even more excellent. And so there are the references. There's a shameless plug for Empowering Editing. And just to thank you very much indeed for engaging. Thanks so much.
Okay, great. Thanks, Patrick. That was really, really interesting and helpful. We've got a few minutes for students to kind of put their mics on if they'd like to make a comment or ask a question. Yes, Natalie, we'll be sending out slides whenever I get them, maybe this afternoon or tomorrow.
No press this afternoon, I promise. You heard it here
Okay.
first.
So what I tend to do is send the slides and the recording link out together to everyone that registered. So yeah. Anyone else want to make a comment or ask Patrick a question about their specific literature review while we've got him here? I guess for me, it prompts things that I went through doing my literature review. And just keep it short, I'm going to try and keep it short. So, there was seminal authors from the 80s that kind of kicked off the field I was in. And but anything written in the 80s later gets a critique of how poorly it was written or how poorly they collected their data or whatever. But they still remained like seminal masters in the field. So that's, I found, a challenge to like acknowledge those key authors and engage with the critique that, their data collection was poor, because things have moved on 40 years later about ethics and data collection. So it was about sort of including and giving those authors a nod, and also recognizing that there was some flaws in their research. Yeah.
That's great, Alison. Thanks so much for sharing. And it's interesting, isn't it? And this is a bit of a disposition. I don't think I've ever seen, you might think about examiners saying, "Oh, um, uh, you haven't cited my seminal work," when they read the
Oh yeah.
thesis. Sometimes we worry about that, but I've never actually seen anyone do that. Maybe they think that, but mostly, I think people, Alison, is really interesting. Most people, I think, would approach that by saying, well, good on Alison for doing that and helping to extend. And yes, you were right. If I were doing this again, and so it's part of that disposition, isn't it? That people
Yeah.
want to learn. And um,
Yeah.
uh, I think it would be very boring if nothing changes and so on. Yeah.
Well, that's right. And I couldn't leave those authors out because of the critique. So anyway, so it's just challenging to write. So Natalie, you've got a question there. Go ahead.
Alison. Patrick, I'm just wondering if you've noticed or if you find that there is any difference in the literature review if you're doing a Doctor of Education, not a Doctor of Philosophy, because a Doctor of Education is a little bit more practical. So is there anything that you've noticed with your experience that could be potentially slightly different with the literature review?
It's a great question. Thank you very
Yeah.
much for that. What I'm thinking is that picking up on your point about the EdD being more practical, I think it may well be that in the literature review for the Doctor of Education, you might be more explicitly focused on and open to strategies that work or don't work. And so questions around utility and pragmatic. So that's all very fine in theory, but does that work in practice? And if so, why or why not? And that kind of thing. And I think that that goes to the criteria, thinking ahead to the end of the thesis, where you write about your contributions to knowledge. Presumably still in the EdD, you'd have contribution to theoretical knowledge, but you would also have um, contributions presumably to policy knowledge and also to practice knowledge, whether that's classrooms or education systems. So it's a great question. I think it's probably more that slight difference of flavor or focus. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, that makes sense.
Yeah,
Appreciate that. Mm.
Just another comment about literature reviews and like if you've got to review a book, like include a book. Well, that's like whatever, 80,000 words you've got to summarize in 2 sentences or something. You know, I found that really challenging rather than someone's key kind of journal article. And in that way, looking at the way other scholars book review that book, just, I mean, you still got to read the book, but looking at the ways other people, discuss the key arguments or the key theories or the key findings is can be helpful as well.
absolutely. Thanks, Alison. That
Book
reminds me.
reviews. Yeah.
Yes, yes. I read a review, this was some years ago, a friend who ended up at the University of Glasgow, and I just, for a different purpose, rereading his review from, I don't know, 1996 or something. And in that, Trevor wrote that this book has come out, he's interested in education policy. This book has come out, it's very detailed and all the rest of it. But and he had a nice way of writing. He and the authors come from different premises, so
Yeah.
they come from different worldviews. And
Yeah.
as you say, Alison, that's really hard to discern, let alone to write about. But yes, sometimes that's the case. They've done all this work, but it reflects a different approach about what's important or
Mm,
valuable.
mm, mm,
Yeah,
mm. Yeah. And as you said, looking at other theses and how they wrote their literature review can just give you some clues with like style and yeah.
absolutely. I think too with the time thing, I don't know people who are, I don't know if you're all immersed in it, but this has been my experience that it's an amazing process where you get in and you're reading, and at first often, certainly I feel overwhelmed. There's all this material there, and how do I know who's who in the zoo or what's important or what's not or whatever? But as you read, it's an amazing process. things start to fall into place and you start to see patterns. And sometimes they might be the same patterns as someone else, but actually often they're not. Because each of us is unique and we're interested in different things. And so I guess all I'd encourage people to do, and you're probably doing it already anyway, and that is to go with that intuition or that feeling of explore, see what's out there and see what kind of sense it's making and so on. And also I think this is just a reflection, which is another tribute to SCPA facilitating conversations. I do know some people who've written their PhD entirely by themselves. So they basically had no supervision and they had no friends they could talk to. So their family say, oh yes, that's all very well, but don't talk to me about your PhD. I just think that's an amazing thing. I do not know how you could do something like that without the dialogue, without saying, well, this is what I think. Do you mind reading this paragraph or whatever? Is that what you think? You know, it is that kind of dialogical, meaning-making discovery process. I don't see how you can do it locked in a room by yourself.
It's true. It's true. It's great if you can have those discussions because, yeah, sometimes we can verbalize things easier than write them. Yeah. Yeah. Any final comments or questions as we finish off soon? Go ahead, Natalie. Yeah.
Sorry, one final question about you said, Patrick, read and read a lot and, go away, read for 6 months. And I think my supervisors told me that too. But as a young researcher, like early researcher, not understanding a lot of things and not knowing what that means, I think there needs to be some more directional framework around that for researchers because, I'm 4.5 years on in my journey now. I understand the reading a lot more when I'm reading it now and things. So I don't know what it is that could be provided to new researchers to understand what that actually means. Because just telling people, just go away and read for 6 months, it's like, well, what do I read? How do I read it? What am I supposed to get out of it? It does take a long journey to understand and pack it all together. So in those early year of reading, I think some highlights or some what should people at that stage be looking for, or how could they interpret it, or sort of pull it together some way because I certainly didn't understand or know that, but I know a lot more now and it makes a lot more sense to me now. Do you know what I mean? So I think there's some way to frame that in a way of tell people a little bit more about how they could go about that process or what they should be getting out of it, and that in a few years' time they will learn a lot more and it will click a lot more later down the track, if that makes sense. Do you know
Look,
what I mean?
excellent
Yeah.
point. And I think from what Fred shared about the Sorbonne, that was a very Sorbonne thing. Go away, you know.
Yeah.
um, look, I agree with you. And there are frameworks around for literature, like guide questions, evaluative questions. But I think exactly as you're saying, I think it's through the conversation with supervisors. So typically I meet my students every 2 weeks, and in that early stage, what are you reading? What do you think about that? Does that seem relevant and so on? So absolutely, it's that more guided, oh, that's interesting. What do you think about that? And sometimes people say, look, I've been reading this stuff. I don't know, epistemology, what's all that about and so on. But more importantly than that, it's that conversation, that dialogue, that shared meaning making and so on. And supervisors, it's not only supervisors, but hopefully they've got some knowledge of the field, but I've supervised out of field where the student knows much more about that field of literature than I do, but it's still about working towards the confirmation of candidature proposal is something I think that concentrates the mind, because you've got to reduce that literature review to however many thousands words it is, so it's very much so what's the essence, what are the main things that you want to focus on. Sometimes it's, have you found a debate that interests you? You think these people they're at cross purposes, and you don't often early on you think, I don't really know where I stand in relation to that and so on. So look, I agree with you. It has to be purposeful reading and so on. Sometimes it's supposedly inefficient. Sometimes we go down rabbit holes and so on, but that can be good. But we can't go down too many of them, sadly. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. Yeah, the risk of going off on tangents and you know, reading an author's reference list and go, oh, I better read that, I better read that, and then you end up. I mean, it's all fascinating, but yeah, it can take you off your topic. As you say, Natalie, especially in that sort of first year when you're not sure who your key authors are. But like you said, Patrick, the student knows more actually often than the supervisors in terms of who the key authors you should be reading anyway. All right. We might finish up there. Thank you so much for your time, Patrick. Very, very helpful for students. And Patrick will be back in August the 20th, writing an excellent, I think an even more excellent critical review workshop. So that's mainly aimed at coursework students, but all are welcome. So thank you very much for your time. I'll finish the recording there.